excited to be here today with Hailey Schoelkopf. Hey there, Hailey, what's up?
Hi, Hugo. Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. And I'd just like to welcome everyone who's joining on YouTube today. Um, I'd love if you could if you could introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're watching from. I'm actually currently in Sydney, Australia, so it's Tuesday morning. Hailey, you're in Massachusetts, close to Boston, right?
Yeah, I am. So, evening here.
Exactly. So I appreciate you joining after dinner as well. And yeah, introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know what your interest in such things is as well. Do you work in machine learning or AI or data science or research science, or are you just here for general interest purposes? Um, I'm really excited to be the host of this Fireside chat series for Out of Bounds, which is an organization that can help you build both machine learning and AI applications, including large language models. Out of Bounds works on infrastructure and productivity tools and has a super interesting platform. They also work on Metaflow, which they open sourced when they ran machine learning infrastructure at Netflix. And I'm going to put a link to Metaflow on GitHub in the chat. So check it out if you're interested and give it a star and share it with friends if that's the type of thing you'd be interested in. I'm also going to put a link to our Luma calendar where we have all our upcoming events as well. So if you enjoy these types of things, please do check out our future ones. But without further ado, we're not here to talk about all that. We're here to talk about open source, open weight, the necessary openness of a lot of the work we're doing in AI and research infrastructure. Hailey, you're a leading researcher at EleutherAI, involved in research on what we'll call language models, both large and small. We're going to avoid the term small large language model, which seems to be coming more and more to the front. And you have a focus on critical evaluation, efficient distributed training, and interpreting the inner workings of AI and ML systems. You're also a key contributor to widely used open source projects. Well, you maintain the LM, the language model evaluation harness, which backs the Hugging Face leaderboard, among many other things. So I'm excited to get into that. You work on GPT-NeoX. And the reason I've invited you on, and we've spoken before, is because, in my opinion, you play a wonderful and significant role in advancing open source AI. So, firstly, thank you for all your work. You also publish research in top academic venues, contribute to the open source community, and manage collaborative research projects. So all of those things are so wonderful. I wonder if you could give us a brief introduction to how you ended up doing what you're doing, and perhaps I think everything I said was accurate, but if I made any mistakes, just correct me and tell me I'm wrong as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Super kind words. Yeah, so I work at EleutherAI. We're sort of a small organization that does open source research on large language models and other large scale AI systems. We do sort of a variety of things, including doing our own research. You might know us from some previous open source models like GPT-Neo and GPT-J or Pythia. And we also maintain a couple libraries that are widely used in the open source community for researchers and sort of just like practitioners alike. So I spend a lot of my time maintaining the LM evaluation harness, which is a library that we have for sort of making zero shot and few shot prompted evaluation of large language models sort of standardized and reproducible. And been super happy to see a lot of people sort of using this for their research or for things like the OpenLLM leaderboard, which is really a great initiative. Happy to play a small role in sort of serving as infrastructure for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for those of you, there may be some of you who haven't heard of Eleuther before and don't recognize some of these things. If you've used Hugging Face's Open LLM leaderboard, you've been using the LM evaluation harness because it's the back end for it. And there are many other examples of such things. I mean, it's used by lots of organizations like NVIDIA, Cohere, New Research. Big fan of New as well, actually. So I would love, so as you know, and as some viewers and listeners may know, my background's in academic research. I went to the dark side and came to industry. I think there's one of the big challenges of our age, I think, is, we talk about it a bit, but not enough, is the huge talent drain from academia to industry, and actually, and how knowledge is becoming a lot more siloed. That's why I'm so fascinated by the origin story of Eleuther, which began as a grassroots community on Discord. I love that it was Discord as well. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit about this evolution and what it was like to be part of a transition from kind of casual discussions on Discord to becoming a leading nonprofit in AI research.
Yeah, totally. I think, yeah, as you mentioned, like there's sort of an interesting tension between sort of like open and closed in terms of research and models, and sort of how knowledge shifts between academia and industry. But uh, machine learning and like the AI space more recently is like a very interesting case because I think that it's comparatively easy to sort of like learn the basics and make it like a huge impact on, say, like the path of open source AI. In the case of Eleuther, sort of before, like some of this happened before I joined the organization, but it started out when OpenAI sort of published the GPT-2 paper. A bunch of people on a machine learning Discord just said, "Hey, I think we can do that," and they went off and trained a GPT-2 sized model that was competitive with it, and just like released it publicly. And at the time, like the costs needed to do this were not quite as high as they are now. So this was sort of possible to do quote unquote frontier AI research. And so as time went on, people at EleutherAI, as just sort of like a, a side hustle basis as volunteers, worked on sort of training bigger and better open source models of the time to make them available to researchers to like sort of understand how they worked, especially since these were trained on public training data. So yeah, I joined Eleuther sort of midway through this process where it had been around as a community for a while, but was actually thinking about sort of becoming a more formal organization where people could contribute to research full time as a more sustainable path. And so I had gotten involved in this through some other open collaborations, and this is the Big Science Research Workshop, spearheaded by Hugging Face. It was basically like a sort of it aims to do sort of like a CERN for AI, like massive distributed collaboration to train a big language model, which was Bloom, this multilingual language model, released in 2022. And basically, it was open to all researchers to just sort of join their Slack and start participating and sitting in on meetings and collaborating in projects. And through this, I met Eleuther, where this was also possible. So yeah, it's definitely been an interesting journey as we sort of like became a sort of like small nonprofit org where people were full-time instead of just working on a volunteer basis. Definitely nice to have sort of like open source be more sustainable. But yeah, interesting. And I love that about ML, that people can sort of get involved even when they don't previously have experience or formal academic training or degrees.
Absolutely. And of course, what I presented was a false dichotomy in many ways between academia and industry and nonprofits and these types of things. We have a long history of, you know, certain types of open research happening in for-profit. Think about Bell Labs, or even think about the Guinness factory in the early 1900s, where a young man named William Gossett developed student's t-test and then published that under the pseudonym of student, because Guinness didn't allow their employees to publish under their real names. On top of that, I love the idea of, I don't think enough people, so when I worked in science research, I don't think enough people recognize how much science happens through emails and conversations, and now on Slack and Discord, and how much of it used to happen by people like in Europe, right? Riding horses to take meteorology data from Berlin to Paris, and that type of stuff. So, as I said, I think a lot of researchers are moving from academia to tech. I would like to, before getting into the types of models and evaluation that we're here to talk about, Eleuther does operate in a unique nonprofit space. So I'm just wondering what advantages or challenges you see with nonprofits in AI compared to academia and industry.
Yeah, definitely. I think that so one big advantage of sort of being like a nonprofit sort of positioned, I guess, somewhere between academia in a traditional sense and like sort of industry, is that people like us and people like Allen Institute for AI, AI2, get to work on sort of like things that aren't necessarily incentivized by sort of traditional incentive structures in academia. So much of academia is driven by sort of like generating novel citations and novel like publishable research papers, where like things that really push the field forward may be sort of these novel research insights, but also maybe things like, say, building better infrastructure, like shared open source libraries, or sort of moving forward the state of the tooling in the fields. And so I think like the benefit of nonprofits like us or LLMAI is that we get to work on some of these sort of like core research topics, like say training foundation models that people downstream can use in their products or in their research, or sort of like work on this like infrastructural work it's depends on who you ask. Some people say that it's easier than you might think to do this in academia, but often sort of doesn't seem really like compatible with traditional structures in academia. So I'd say that that's sort of like a nice distinguishing factor and sort of the case for these sorts of nonprofits as opposed to just sort of university research institutions.
Um, and if people wanted to get involved, I mean, even to just check out what's happening, I mean, I'll put the link to your website in the show notes and in the chat, but they can join the Discord channel as well, right? And start chatting today, right now.
Yeah, totally. I think, yeah, like you mentioned, a lot of AI research these days, especially or in the open source space, happens on Discord. So yeah, if you're not in the EleutherAI Discord, discord.gg/EleutherAI, or in the News Research Discord, for example, then definitely you're missing out. And yeah, Eleuther, we've sort of uh, strived to keep like our research as much as possible, not just sort of fully openly published along with all the like code and artifacts, but also where possible, sort of like orchestrated and done in the opens, like various projects that I've participated in at EleutherAI, sort of the idea for the project, the experiments done in the project, discussions have all sort of happened in like a public channel on a Discord thread. And there's all sorts of benefits, like people just dropping in who maybe authored the work you're talking about and saying, oh, hey, actually, I did it a different way because of this, or, oh, maybe you should try this idea. So yeah, huge benefits to sort of sharing things openly and building in the open.
Awesome. So because of your work and the fact that you maintain the eval harness, so we know that we know in the abstract that looking at your data and evaluation are absolutely fundamental and key to building and maintaining AI systems. But I am interested in your thoughts on what exactly are we evaluating? How does this go beyond, like, we're like, make your product, blah, 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 and make sure there's ROI and business value and all of the, and I mean, blah, blah, blah in a very generous sense, to be clear. But that can't be all there is to it. I mean, we need to think about model alignment. We also need to think about who's setting the standards for what gets evaluated. So, I mean, to step back a bit, a lot of our machine learning practice and deep learning practice, a lot of it's been bottom up, but a bunch has been top down from organizations like Meta and Google, right? And I think we need to question who sets the standards that we put into place. So more generally, what are we evaluating and who gets to decide what are we evaluating?
Yeah, definitely. It's an important question. I think, yeah, there's sort of like a whole gamut of like evaluations and sort of who's using them, what might they want to use it for. I think that like, yeah, in general, if you have the means to sort of think carefully about what your product is doing, maybe like how you might test that it's doing that well, and sort of how to measure improvements, then an evaluation that you sort of constructed yourself for your own use case is going to be the most sort of valid and useful to improve on. Um, I guess in terms of like who sets the standards, this is definitely a tricky question that I think a lot about. I think one thing that's very interesting is that just like inherently, at least in the past, and I think this is still the case and going to be the case in future, is that people who are sort of training the models, like these organizations that are training models, both because they sort of have large teams to do this, and because they just have the most hands-on experience with those sort of like new technology as it's developing, have the most experience with sort of setting up and performing evaluations. And so I definitely think that this is something that we should sort of push back on and try to build up like capacity for the science of AI evaluation like outside of these orgs. So like, for example, something that's very cool that's been happening is organizations like the UK AI Safety Institute and the US AI Safety Institute associated with NIST are two organizations set up by government to sort of build capacity for the science of, yeah, what are we measuring when we evaluate models and like, why do we want to do this? How do we do it? outside of the organizations that typically train these models. And so I think more of this is needed in terms of like downstream users deciding what do they care about, what would they like models to reflect, what is sort of the ideal model behavior, especially for these sort of generalist systems, is definitely worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And I do think I can't actually remember this. Chris Wiggins and Matthew Jones, who wrote the book How Data Happened, and it's essentially it frames the story of data science's how data science reallocates power in society. And Chris talks about something, I can't remember whose it is, but it's a three-way game between government, organizations, and the citizenry of any particular country, that there is some sort of and it's game theoretic in some ways, but some sort of constant struggle and tension and jostle between these different institutions. And the reason that came to mind is something I'm hearing in that is that sure we have top down evaluation frameworks being used, but we also have bottom up ones being used. We have non-profits being involved. So having this constant dialogue between people with different interests and different incentives is a deeply important and fundamental aspect of any space, but in particular the one we're working in currently.
Yeah, I definitely think, yeah, all sorts of people need to be involved in, yeah, setting these standards, speaking up for what they think should shape them.
Yeah.
Nice. Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, well, or I think that one other interesting aspect here is like I don't think that this process is zero sum in general at all. I think everyone sort of wants people to get better at evaluation, better understand these models, better understand their limitations, and so on. But one interesting thing is that sort of like there's an incentive if you are a person who trains models and you have a good evaluation set. There's an incentive to keep that private and not release it to the community because as soon as an evaluation is made public, then everyone is going to start to sort of either implicitly or explicitly sort of optimize and train for better scores on that benchmark, or the benchmark will just like leak into sort of web data and training data sets, making it less useful. And so there is, in that sense, sort of this interesting zero-sum dynamic where there might be sort of some good eval sets that people have curated internally at these model training orgs, but that there's no incentive to release them, even if they might, in an ideal world, want to, if there were no downside.
so knowing that, how do we build capacity for expertise in evaluations across the board?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in general, like evaluation is sort of like it's something that everyone agrees is like a very important part of AI research, just like people agree that you must look at your data and like value the data a lot. But evaluation and data work are two sort of like, I guess, lower prestige traditionally aspects of machine learning development or sort of AI development. And so definitely like I think that people are starting to care a whole lot more about evaluation. But to some extent, yeah, I think it does have to sort of I guess not necessarily be flashier, but people have to like take an interest in it and want to sort of prioritize this over maybe tweaking the architecture or other things. And yeah, I think that, yeah.
Um, so for people building AI systems today, I'm just wondering what concrete steps they can take to incorporate tools like the LM eval harness into their workflows, and what practical changes can they make to think more robustly about AI evaluation?
Yeah, definitely. I guess like I mentioned, I think that one thing to think about is sort of like what sort of stage of the, I guess like development deployment pipeline you're working at and what sort of level of abstraction you have. So for example, like the LM evaluation harness, to use the specific example, is, or at least originally was targeted sort of directly at researchers looking to train models and evaluate sort of different models. And over time, like it's there's been more sort of interest from people who are fine tuning open source models, especially. So that's where things like the Open LLM leaderboard come in, where like the community trying to build sort of the best open models on top of openly released sort of pre-trained bases are trying to build better models. So in that sense, the library mostly supports sort of researchers or practitioners closer to the sort of research and like model improvement side of things, as compared to like product deployment. So I think that like this tool specifically is better for sort of like model evaluation as compared to like task specific or application specific evaluation. but does still aim to provide tooling just to make any sort of like LM evaluation easier if you want to set one up yourself. Um,
That makes sense. I think something we've been talking around is, the existence of these pretty large models, which I think there's something in the cultural consciousness. There are two forces. One is large models that everyone can use, but also that have their own biases, and their own ways of interaction that may not be applicable and everywhere. So, for example, as an Australian, I can't quite say this. I know a bunch of my European friends and colleagues feel that ChatGPT is a bit polite in a North American manner. And they say it isn't necessarily appropriate for the types of conversations they want to have. So I'm just wondering, in this tension between big corporate interests putting out LLMs kind of on top of the mountain, compared with a world in which we have smaller models, that are perhaps even local models, and local in the sense of developed by local communities. I know the work that EleutherAI has done on polyglot, for example, in having other languages in LLMs is speaking to this. But I'm wondering your thoughts on this and what Eleuther is doing in this space.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, completely agree that there's sort of some need for like customization and serving communities that aren't just sort of, I guess, like the median ChatGPT user. Um, so in the past, Eleuther has sort of brought on like a large amount of volunteers to try and sort of collect data and train models in their own language. This is the Polyglot project. Um, and more recently, we've also worked a little bit on collaborating with a startup called Synth Labs, founded by people from sort of EleutherAI and CarperAI alumni, to sort of do work researching like RLHF and sort of customizability in RLHF. So I think that like something that's underexplored but a very good niche for open source to inhabit is sort of thinking about how can we make models that are either a single model that's sort of much more adaptable to, like you say, like a specific user's like preferences or desires, or how we can sort of allow every user to like custom create a model for themselves. I think this sort of goes hand in hand as well with things like sort of on-device models and like very like personalizable small language models, where we might want something that's very specific and tailored to you for something like, I don't know, processing your photos or your emails, where you might not want to like sort of send all this data over an API.
Yeah, and I don't think enough people realize how powerful a lot of the models you can run locally are, and even the ability to run, for example, Llama 3.2 3B on my iPhone. I can run it locally, which is absolutely incredible. But I suppose when we had a prep call for this conversation a few weeks back, and so much has happened since then, right? I mean, the space is moving so quickly. So I think maybe the two things we can talk. Well, the two things that come to mind for me, I'm sure a lot more come to mind for you. Llama 3.2 last week, and then OpenAI o1, somewhat recently as well. So I wonder what has happened for you personally with these two releases, and what has it spurred you to think about at Eleuther yourself, but as a team?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think things that come to mind that happened recently are, yeah, like you mentioned, like Llama 3.2 multimodal, and also AI2's Molmo happening on the same day,
Of
sort of a
course.
multimodal variant of their Olmo model. Yeah, so definitely I've been thinking a little bit recently about multimodal evaluation, even though multimodality is not like historically my sort of area of expertise. We've been exploring trying to add sort of tooling around like evaluating multimodal models on like text plus image input, text output tasks for things like MMMU. And so we've launched like a prototype of that in the LM evaluation harness. I think that one thing that's key in these sort of like recent multimodal releases is, like you mentioned, some like the release of smaller models like Olmo-E or Olmo-E, yeah, the mixture of experts, MOE, Olmo model,
Mm.
which is, yeah, 7 billion parameters, but only 1 billion are used at a time. So much more efficient to run on device. And then, like you said, like the sort of like 3B Llama 3.2. And so,
there's 3B. There's a 1B model as well, and then there's a bloody sorry, pardon my language, but there's a 11B vision model. This is incredible. I can like get this stuff
mhm.
running on my 16 gig, MacBook Pro. I'm flying, as you know, I'm flying to Europe tomorrow. I can play around with these models when I'm up in the sky.
Yeah, definitely. I think yeah, the ecosystem is really like growing and improving in this respect, especially for yeah, like on-device things. Um, yeah, I guess one thing that was interesting is so the Molno model includes like sort of a couple different things in its fine-tuning data set. One of them is sort of a synthetic data set specifically made to allow the models to sort of indicate where an object is in an image, like it's like a pointing feature.
Mm.
And I think this is like a huge unlock as the AI2 like release mentions for things like web agents, sort of like detecting where a button is on a web page or sort of like determining which things a language agent might want to interact with. And so like I think that it's going to be the case that sort of continuing to scale up like foundation models give like improvements most likely, but also like their targeted improvements on the specific things we find we want to use language models for will also provide huge gains. So like a lot of the sort of quote unquote efficiency improvements we've seen with large language models in the open and especially like small language models is sort of heavy data filtering and choosing your pre-training data more carefully. And this works really well if you have some sense of sort of what tasks you want your model to do. You can just sort of pick the data that matters most for those tasks or generate a synthetic data set that works best for those tasks and make a model that's very good at the specific case. So small language models, if they don't have to be sort of fully general purpose in the sense that ChatGPT or sort of GPT-4 base have to be, then they can be a lot better in the same small form factor, or sort of with a smaller form factor. Yeah.
So I'm wondering just what some of the most common misunderstandings you've seen when it comes to evaluation using LLMs or LMs more generally, but evaluation in particular, and how the community can be better informed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, I think there's definitely a tendency to sort of gloss over the particulars of evaluation. Um, One thing that I think is definitely very relevant and important is that I think like evaluation has to be in some sense context dependent. So, for example, like so the MMLU data set is like a very, very popular sort of model capability evaluation, multiple choice question answering task for large language models. And there's sort of MMLU is actually somewhat unique among these tasks because the authors like put forward sort of a standard prompting format for MMLU to use, which is formatted basically like a standardized test would be, where you give the model the question and you give it answer A, answer B, answer C, listed out sort of in context one after the other, and then you ask the model to predict which answer letter it thinks is correct. And it turns out that sort of like uh, this is like the canonical prompt format for MMLU, but if you want to evaluate a model as it's training, it's often better to sort of frame the task a bit more like a sort of next token prediction or like sentence completion task,
Mm.
where for sort of models that aren't that capable, they're not yet able to follow complex instructions and sort of answer with the letter correctly, but they will answer with the text of the answer they think is correct more early in training. And so as training progresses, as models get much, much better during pre-training, it's better to use the sort of standard canonical prompt format that's more testing instruction following. But sort of like where you are in training, what sort of model you're training, and what purpose you want evaluation to serve, whether it's like progress measure for your pre-training versus sort of like downstream capability on this instruction following variance. It sort of changes what you want to use the eval for, changes how you want to set it up. And so sort of there's not really one size fits all prompt for like various tasks or one size fits all methodology.
I'm glad you mentioned MMLU. I do, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's so of course that's in the eval harness and it's multiple
Mhm.
choice as you mentioned, but is it like 70% of the data sets in the eval harness multiple choice or something? Or did I make that number up? It's a
Yeah,
significant
so
number, isn't it?
yeah, that's a good thing to bring up. So yeah, in the eval harness, we do support a lot of multiple choice evals. There are trade-offs in doing multiple choice. So like so historically, the sort of like for example on like the GPT-3 paper, which is sort of the first that presents like few-shot prompting as sort of a thing that models can do. And in-context learning introduces this. There, sort of many of the tasks are very specific, sort of like yes, no, or like two or three classification problems. And they're often presented, like I was describing, like sort of like a next token prediction or a sentence completion task to be as similar to sort of like the base language modeling objective as possible. And I think that this is sort of very useful for models that are maybe not that capable as you're pre-training them, or just in general for sort of base models, because I think of them as like unit tests for sort of language modeling and sort of task completion ability. In the sense that sort of they'll give you signal on whether your model is learning useful things, whether it's outputting sane answers and completing text in the way that you expect. But yeah, a shift that we've definitely seen in the past years is with like instruction tuned models, especially sort of trained in this chat format and trained to give sort of like a verbose chain of thought before every answer. It's much more reasonable to sort of ask them to sort of freeform generate until they get to an answer. And so like because the sort of intended use case of these models has changed, like the way that we want to evaluate them has also shifted. But however, like multiple choice evaluations are sort of easy to set up and easy to score, and so they've still remains like popular as compared to sort of generating many tokens from a model and then having to deal with sort of like trying to figure out what did my model answer? Is it correct or not? Is it sort of does it contain like the magic word that I think is correct or not? All these sorts of things are a little bit finicky, and so multiple choice can like let you avoid some of that, but it does come with downsides for sure.
Absolutely. And I think something you're speaking to is the fact that it's absolutely amazing that as a civilization, we've created these technologies that generate open-ended responses, right? But then there's the challenge that they generate open-ended responses. So once you are trying to judge the accuracy or efficacy of an open-ended response, wait, are you doing string matching, or are you using regular expressions or something like that? I always joke that I think we'd have AGI when we didn't have to use regular expressions anymore, and so we're getting there. That's a joke because I think AGI is a red herring. But I am interested. I'd have to fire myself if we went this far down the path of evaluation and didn't talk about using LLMs as evaluators and as judges themselves. So I'm just wondering more generally how you think about LLMs as judges and the pros and cons of that approach.
Right, yeah. So it's a very interesting thing, like evaluating sort of free-form responses from a language model, because, well, the technology that we're developing and trying to evaluate language models is sort of like the best tool we have till now of sort of parsing natural language and performing operations on like natural text. And so it's sort of like a natural instinct to try to use language models to evaluate themselves. And this has picked up a lot of steam in like yeah, recent times in the community. I think that, yeah, sort of like LLM as a judge became sort of commonplace overnight, almost, and somewhat without sort of checking the validity. So I think that definitely before applying to LLM as a judge to a new task, it's worth evaluating the judge and deciding that it's sort of like a well-defined task that the model can actually do well before sort of just offloading it. But it is the case that like these models are competent at the sorts of things that we want to sort of evaluate them on. But there are definitely sort of flaws and like failure modes. Like for example, both language models and humans sort of have this problem of being easily convinced by either like very long outputs that are very verbose or outputs that are sort of very authoritative sounding. Like I think there's a bunch of research and like commentary on the fact that if you ChatGPT phrasing its answers in Markdown has a huge impact on like human preference over those answers. Um, and so like this is a failure mode that's also shared by language models, where sort of like the longer a response is, models that are RLHF for longer will sort of tends toward these like super long responses, even if they're sort of less, even if there's less content in them, just because they seem better to human raters who don't really like read them word by word and really think carefully about the claims. So
Totally.
basically, like
Yeah, and I think something I'm hearing in there is also something we've kind of danced around as well, is the lack of robust uncertainty quantification in language models as well. So I actually want to read something to you that I read the other day. I'll post a link. It's a transcript of a conversation that the Michael Jordan of machine learning, was in, and he said it's important to realize that the treatment of uncertainty is quite inadequate in current large language models. If you say, ChatGPT, you just told me something, how sure are you about what you said? It might say, I'm very sure. It doesn't do that because it's reasoning under uncertainty, but because its training data had a similar question and some human said, I'm sure, essentially. And so at least anecdotally, let's say, in all my interactions with large language models, it's very tough to get one to say, I don't know the answer. It will run you around in circles before doing that. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous failure mode. So how do you think about their ability or inability to reason under uncertainty?
Yeah, I guess like I think the sort of key problem here is one of like I guess like education about the technology. Like I think the reason this is so difficult is because like maybe you and I both know that like ChatGPT does not really have enough knowledge about itself to sort of know for a fact that it's speaking truthfully or not when it says like I'm sure or I'm not sure or I
Mm,
think I was wrong. But like most people using this technology don't don't know like what a how a large language model works under the hood, what sort of information it has access to, or like whether or not you should believe it and take it as at its word. So I think like yeah, this is sort of like something that at minimum we need to sort of do better at like communicating to the average person sort of what the limitations of the technology are, how it works to the extent that sort of that can help explain to people like what a mental model is of like how it performs and when we should expect it to perform well. Um, yeah, I guess like
yeah, I love that, and I do think it's about setting expectations. It is tough when new models are released and there aren't necessarily something we've had the rug of release notes pulled out from under us. I think like software used to have release notes, and for some reason it doesn't anymore necessarily. And going back to thinking through how we interoperate, you know, human computer interaction, right? Um, it does remind me of a story that our mutual Hamel Hussein worked with a wonderful engineer called Philip Carter at Honeycomb, and I think they put the first LLM in production outside of the institutions where people build LLMs, and this was an LLM where you'd say something in natural language to generate a honeycomb query. So that's kind of like a SQL query, but specific to honeycomb for those who don't know. And in the end, I may butcher this slightly, but I think I'm getting the right vibe, even if I'm not getting the details correct. What they did was they had Philip generate responses of what he would like to see the LLM do. Then they'd get the LLM to generate responses, and then they'd put them both in a spreadsheet. And Philip would say what he wanted corrected, what he didn't want corrected. Then they'd get another LLM to work on that. And they did that through several iterations of Philip essentially hand annotating corrections and incorrect things in the LLM's response in order to then, I think, fine tune the base model on these new interactions and responses as well. And the fact that this feels like alchemy. I always thought hyperparameter tuning was like alchemical and felt like incantations, but this is a whole new level of something which isn't scientific in kind of the regular, and not that I have an expectation that it's scientific, but I think in the cultural consciousness, it is like these are, the results of science and technology and that type of stuff, whereas it's something quite different now that we're working with, right?
yeah, I definitely think yeah, the sort of like rise of synthetic data. I mean, what you described sounds like maybe we could call that synthetic data or something
Yeah,
like that.
absolutely.
But yeah, I totally think that like this is only going to rise in prominence, and that like yeah, people who can sort of shape model behavior by sort of shaping synthetic data sets well is like a very yeah awesome, powerful skill to have. I yeah, I think something that like really excites me for the future is sort of like I know Anthropic with Claude thinks a lot about sort of how Claude should behave and how to sort of shape that behavior and then instill those like sort of like that spec for how models should behave into their model. And same with OpenAI, sort of is like building out a team for like enforcing model behavior and sort of thinking about like a spec as well, which they've published an initial version of like how models should act. And I think this is something that's sort of very exciting, and maybe like the future of post-training is really like sort of describing how a model should behave, maybe almost like case law or examples of behavior, and then really getting like something that's like behaves in the way that you expect your product to behave, maybe like.
Absolutely. And these are the types of things that hopefully will be describable in, model cards and this type of stuff as well.
Mhm.
Um, I am interested in now talking a bit more about alignment and ethical consideration. So just given the rapid pace of everything, including, the rapid pace of what we've discussed in the past few weeks that we've discussed today, what are the key risks or ethical considerations in evaluation and alignment that you think need more attention?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think something that's very exciting is that there's sort of like an uptick in both safety related and non-safety related like agents benchmarks, sort of like benchmarking like not just like a single large language model and evaluating like a model evaluation, but sort of evaluating a system that might be composed of like multiple language models or sort of a cascade of like control flow and a single language model with repeated calls to it. And so like thinking about both like what do we want to use these models for, and or like what might be sort of like realistic paradigms that we want to test for safety is very exciting. I guess another thing is that like just thinking about like the social impact of these models and like both sort of like before we deploy a model, what might the sort of like downstream social or societal consequences be? Who might this affect most? Like trying to get better at sort of assessing this before we make these deployment decisions is very interesting. And like another thing is like I can't recall if I've mentioned this in this conversation before, but I think in evaluation there's sort of this trade-off where you can basically there's sort of you can interpolate between like how realistic your benchmark is versus like unreal like how realistic versus unrealistic your benchmark is. But as a result, like more realistic settings are going to require just like more money and sort of like more effort to set up an evaluation. So sort of like the best evaluation, especially for things like safety, is going to be like red teaming, especially by sort of like competent, say, domain experts of your model. But this requires both like expertise in like wrangling sort of a, a force of like annotators, and also requires like a substantial amount of money to sort of fairly compensate a potentially like very like specialized skill set of annotators. And so yeah, basically like the best sort of eval we have is to like get people to actually stress test your system and its defenses. But this is very expensive. So thinking about like what proxies we can have to sort of cheaply do this for people who are just sort of maybe doing like smaller scale research or like uh, less wealthy orgs, I guess.
For sure. Who out there is doing? I mean, if people wanted to get involved in red teaming initiatives, is my question. Who should they be paying attention to, and who should they get in touch with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know like one place that's doing plenty of work on red teaming is like the sort of AI safety institutes, which is like, yeah, a very natural thing for them to be working on. I think I know that in the past, DEF CON has hosted like
Mhm.
very public red teaming events where they've sort of massively crowdsourced like these sort of like jailbreaking attempts and prompts. And I think that there are often like, whether it's by like other startups working in the safety space or other things like sort of hosting like jailbreaking competitions. Like I know that there's one, I think by Gray Swan AI, it might still be ongoing. I haven't followed it too closely. Basically like offering the ability to try and jailbreak their models and their safeguards that they've developed as research techniques, plus like other models. So I think like in general, sort of honing your skills as like a jailbreaker or sort of red teamer can be done on existing systems. And there are also sort of like red teaming competitions to do. I guess one caveat here to bring up is definitely that certain systems, and certain companies, sort of prohibit red teaming and jailbreaking in their terms of service, or sort of will ban people for trying to circumvent the safeguards. And on the one hand, it makes sense to try to sort of ban people who are actively trying to get harmful content out of your model. But on the other hand, sort of for the net good of the ecosystem, it can be very beneficial for these companies to implement things that are sort of like safe harbors or safeguards, preventing researchers who are investigating red teaming and jailbreaking from being sort of banned from these services or losing access to these models as a result of performing their research.
Absolutely. And you want external people doing this, of course, for the public good. I mean, look, I didn't necessarily want to go down this path, but that I'm all for companies building products that help a lot of people to do a lot of things and then making money from doing that. There is an argument that when things become critical enough for society to function, they become a public good and some form of social infrastructure. So there is an argument that Twitter and Facebook are actually public goods and should become public utilities. And so we saw, for example, took a long time to, this is the history of antitrust as well, to get, to break down the railroads and then electricity and that type of stuff. So it did become public utilities. I do wonder whether they're like how you think at EleutherAI and you personally think about the role of these systems actually being public utilities in the end.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's somewhat difficult to say, especially like with like the trajectory of this technology. I think something that would be great is sort of like data sets is sort of a public utility or like a uh, publicly available good that people can benefit from. So like one thing that EleutherAI is working on, although I'm not directly involved in this project, is sort of like curating and collating sort of data that is like expressly sort of permissively licensed and trying to collect data that is sort of most like in the public domain or maybe say like labeled by like Apache 2 or MIT and trying to sort of like ensure the provenance of this data and like
Yeah.
collect data that people can sort of train on without being worried about being sued and sort of allowing people as a result of this data set to feel more comfortable about like releasing and disclosing their training data. And there have been other proposals about, say, like sort of setting up a like public trust for maybe like book training data where people can contribute to a pool of data and maybe gain some sort of like bargaining power over this data set by as a result of participating in it. So definitely, I think that there's ways to sort of set things up as like a public good.
That's super cool. And I mean, to thinking more about, publicly available data, transparent data, I think that dovetails nicely into Eleuther's work on Pythia, for example, which, and I'm reading this from your Eleuther's copy now, but a suite of models designed to enable controlled scientific research on transparently trained LLMs. So maybe you could tell us a bit about the Pythia project and why it's relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so Pythia is a research project we did that, yeah, I'm super fond of. And so basically the gist is that like when we were working on this, this like started around sort of fall of 2022. The sort of landscape was very different in terms of like what was available, open source and open weight. There were sort of very few examples available if you wanted to use an open weight model or like study them in your research as a researcher. Like there were only sort of the OPT models from Meta. The Bloom models had recently released, which were multilingual, and like GPT-2 and a few models from EleutherAI, probably others that aren't coming to mind, but sort of like there were very limited selections if you wanted to research these models. And in particular, if you wanted to ask questions about how like sort of models evolve as you sort of train them longer, or things like how do they change as you scale them up, or basically like how do the contents of the training data impact the model behavior that you get out. And so we trained Eleuther like a set of 8 different sizes of model from 70 million to 12 billion parameters, where we train these models not just with sort of like consistent settings and on like this, but on the same data in like the same ordering. And we also released not just like the final models and the data set, but also like 150 checkpoints across training for all of these models. And so the goal was to sort of like allow a lot more researchers to like ask and answer the sort of questions that we and others found interesting that but couldn't yet. So people have done a lot of work on things like interpretability and understanding how the internals of these models are laid out and how they evolve over training, or done things like researching like gender bias or the impact of the training data on sort of like social biases that exhibited by these models or other behaviors, and trying to like trace back behavior to the training data. So sort of, yeah, like the idea is to like differentially accelerate things like social impact and safety research by sort of putting out like publicly available resources and sort of research infrastructure. So these were models, not just code, but just like the code bases that we've released and maintained are also sort of research infrastructure meant to empower researchers.
Fantastic. And I've just linked to your Pythia GitHub repository as well, so people can check it out. I love that a lot of this conversation has been around infrastructure, and we've already been chatting for 50 minutes. Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? Doesn't it, Hailey?
Mhm.
I've got a couple of questions to wrap up. I'm wondering, looking to the future, how do you see the infrastructure for open source AI research evolving? And what role do you envision AI playing in that journey?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so yeah, EleutherAI currently maintains like GPT-NeoX and the LM evaluation harness, both like libraries that have been frequently used by other people in the open source community for training and evaluation. And I envision like us trying to continue to maintain these libraries as like research infrastructure for people. I think something that's exciting is that there's sort of a lot more players in the ecosystem doing things like releasing models open weights or releasing code bases or other sort of like tooling. And like this is really exciting. And I think that we'll see like, yeah, more people sort of entering the space. EleutherAI is sort of, yeah, less focused on, say, like the initial goal being to replicate GPT-3 of the sort of grassroots collective is no longer necessarily like something that's needed when lots of people are releasing capable open weights models already. Um, but I think that we'll see like, yeah, there will be plenty more tooling. I think things like sort of agentic benchmarks and especially things like multimodality as well, continuing like what use cases people envision for long context will all be big. Um, I think that like, yeah, sort of like in general, like we're probably going to see like more tooling, especially on like the sort of deployment ends of these models. Like I know we were just talking before this call about the Llama stack. I know Meta is also sort of trying to make tools to let people more easily deploy these models in sort of realistic settings. So I think that there's also this shift where there's not simply sort of research code bases existing in the open source ecosystem. There's also people trying to make sort of production ready code or code that's less focused on research. So I think that's another shift that's happening and will continue to happen. Yeah, in general, yeah, I think that like hope the space will continue to diversify. We'll definitely continue to maintain our libraries and push for like more open research, more resources for people to work on. Yeah, and transparency in general.
Great. Also, our audience has a lot of, well, it's full of practitioners. So I think we're all wondering what skills we have currently and what skills we can learn to not only keep ourselves employable and pay the rent, but also to contribute as much as possible to a space which is evolving so quickly. So I'm wondering, just looking ahead, what skill sets do you think will be most critical as AI continues to evolve, especially with the increased focus on generative models that people can interact with in natural language?
Yeah, totally. So I think like we were discussing earlier, I think it's only going to continue to be more important to sort of like, I don't know, detect AI BS and like sort of judge whether something is correct or not. And like sort of the skill of like sort of like, yeah, carefully parsing out answers and like judging them is going to be useful for both people who use the technology and work with it. Especially as these systems sort of get better than like maybe people in a specific subject area. And so I think that people who have domain expertise in a specific area, whether it's something like biological sciences, chemistry, or like maybe something like business or anything else really that's like, if you have expertise in your specific domain, I think you're at an advantage when trying to build systems that sort of serve this like set of domain experts or that sort of try to operate in this domain because you're going to be able to sort of judge AI answers, like design systems that integrate sort of assumptions that might come into play in your specific area, and so on. So I think there's really an opportunity to like merge domain knowledge and sort of AI specific knowledge. So people who know both will sort of be very high in demand. I think like yeah, in general, like AI is sort of like very much like many of these things are sort of like engineering problems on the research side of things, like not just sort of what works, but and what's the most elegant mathematically, but also sort of what can you code and what can you write to run fast, especially on a GPU. Yeah, and then I guess another thing that we mentioned is like synthetic data. I think this is an interesting idea that can be taken in a lot of different directions, and especially when building like maybe specialized systems or distilling down larger models into even or small language models even into even smaller language models. So I think that's another thing that's very interesting to keep tabs on and sort of build a skill set in.
Absolutely. I love that you use the term BS as well. So I actually, there's a wonderful, this is going to become relevant in a second. There's a wonderful book, I'm not sure if you know it, from Princeton University Press by a philosopher called Harry Frankfurt. It's a short volume called On Bullshit. And I'm using that term, I'm cussing, but because it's the name of a book published by Princeton University Press. So I feel like that's acceptable here. And it's about the rise of certain types of bullshit in society. And I've linked to that in the show notes and in the YouTube because I've also linked to a new paper called I need to get the name of this paper correct. ChatGPT is bullshit. So it's a scientific paper in ethics and information technology. Unfortunately, I've only been able to find the Springer link, which is behind a paywall. Oh no, it's open access, so you can download the PDF. That's great. But actually, what it does is its argument is that hallucinations are bullshit in the sense explored by Frankfurt in on bullshit. So I think that's actually fascinating, and it comes back to our ideas of its inability, these systems' inability to say, I don't know. If it doesn't know something, it will take me around in circles, making things up constantly. The other thing, I don't want to over-index on BS and these types of things, but I am interested in your thoughts on what happens when we use synthetic data on top, like if we use synthetic data all the way down. So I'm actually going to quote Cory Doctorow, who thinks about, he's writing about model collapse and these types of things. And he quotes Sadowski, who has a great term to describe the problem of feeding the results of LLMs into more LLMs and so on. He refers to it as Habsburg AI. And he writes, just as royal inbreeding produced a generation of supposed supermen who were incapable of reproducing themselves, so too will feeding a new model on the exhaust stream of the last one produce an ever-worsening gyre of tightly spiraling nonsense that eventually disappears up its own, and I won't say the last word. But that's to set the context for what are the issues? And we need more and more data, of course, but what are the issues, the actual technical and practical issues of using synthetic data generation all the way down?
Wow, yeah, strong words about synthetic data.
Yeah.
And model collapse. So I guess one thing to flag is that there's been work that has shown like sort of like evidence against model collapse happening, in particular in the setting where sort of you do still have access to your original data set. Like you're not just sort of at every step training solely on synthetic data and sort of losing info all the way. You're sort of augmenting your existing data with synthetic data. And so I think that like something where synthetic data will probably very much shine is where you want to sort of customize your model's behavior. Maybe it's like format or I guess like quote unquote personality of the deployed model, by sort of like tuning on synthetic data of the right vibe in addition to whatever sort of like well-labeled expert data you might have. So that's something to keep in mind. I guess another thing is, yeah, like I definitely think synthetic data is going to be most effective in situations where you have the ability to verify it in some way. So like, for example, with code, if you have like a, enough unit test to sort of cover and like define the functionality correctly, then it might be very easy to generate like synthetic data that is simply correct solutions to this given piece of code or piece of logic. And so like I think that domains like that are going to like be most easy to sort of, I guess, like iterate on with synthetic data or sort of hill climb on with synthetic data and not worry too much about sort of diverging from usefulness. Um, yeah, I think it's like an open question of like how do we sort of effectively verify and filter maybe like synthetic data in an open-ended domain,
Yeah.
especially given that we like can't really do this super well for like human data or human labelers are still susceptible to sort of making mistakes here.
Absolutely.
So,
And yeah, I appreciate that. And I just want to make clear that the quotations I read were intended to be slightly provocative as well. And as we saw earlier, with the example from Honeycomb of Philip Carter and Hamel Hussein, if you get humans in the loop in in
mhm,
in a productive way, with synthetic data generation, humans can augment synthetic data and vice versa in a way that can end
mhm.
up creating better data that's actually practical and provides utility, as opposed to this ever worsening gyre, right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I think it can be like a virtuous feedback loop.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
mhm.
Um, well, we're at time, but I would just love to know, as we've discussed, we're in a space that's moving so quickly. Just what are you excited about at the moment, Hailey, for what you're up to at the moment in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, like as mentioned, like working still on the eval harness and trying to sort of like expand our coverage of things like multimodality. So definitely excited to get into that space a bit more. In general, yeah, sort of excited to see like what people find these models useful for. Like I think that like we're continually sort of lowering the barrier to sort of using good models and running them on your specific use case. And I'd be excited to see sort of what people end up doing with like long context that's now sort of prevalent, or what people end up doing now that multimodality is much more accessible. Yeah, and that'll sort of shape like how we can design future small language models to better serve these use cases.
Fantastic. Well, I'd love to wrap up by thanking everyone for joining and anyone who's watching after the fact. We've got people saying thank you for your expertise and sharing your expertise in the chat already, Hailey. I do want to thank you for sharing your expertise, for your wisdom, your generosity in coming and having a conversation like this, and also for all the work you and your team at Eleuther does. I invited you on because I love all the work you do. So thank you for everything you do for the community also.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words and for having me. And thank you to everyone who came and watched. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. And